The royal guard had been silent the whole time, standing in that immovable, impossible posture. But when President Obama stopped and offered him a handshake, the guard finally spoke. It was just one sentence, 8 words that made the former commander-in-chief visibly shake. "I've never heard anything like that," he said, his voice cracking. And what happened next, nobody saw it coming. Before we reveal what those words were, hit that subscribe button and comment below where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The November drizzle wasn't heavy enough to cancel anything, but it was persistent enough to make London feel like it was wrapped in wet wool. Just past 11 in the morning, the sky hung so low you could almost reach up and touch the clouds with your fingertips. Barack Obama wasn't supposed to be here, not officially, anyway. No press pool, no advance team, no carefully choreographed photo ops. Just a former president in a charcoal overcoat walking through Wellington Barracks, with the kind of quiet purpose that only comes when someone's paying respects on their own terms. His security detail kept their distance close enough to do their job, far enough back to let the man breathe. Agent Sarah Mitchell, his lead protection officer, spoke quietly into her sleeve microphone. "Raven is approaching the memorial site. Timeline unchanged, weather's holding. Copy that, Mitchell," came the response from command. "Any irregularities in the area?" "Negative. Standard ceremonial posting. 1 Welsh guard on duty. Tourists keeping appropriate distance." You could see it in Obama's stride. This wasn't the measured pace of diplomacy. This was personal. He moved like someone carrying weight that had nothing to do with the weather. In his right coat pocket, his fingers absently turned over a small bronze object, a challenge coin he'd been carrying for months. Without really thinking about it, Guard's memorial sat in the center courtyard, simple, dignified. Under the gray sky, a few tourists huddled under umbrellas nearby, their voices automatically dropping to whispers, the way people do in places that demand respect. A schoolteacher was explaining something to her group of 12-year-olds. "Now remember, children," she said softly, "this memorial honors soldiers who gave their lives in service. We show respect by being quiet, and oh my goodness, is that?" Her voice trailed off as she recognized the familiar figure approaching. One of the children, a boy with gap teeth and unruly hair, tugged on her coat sleeve. "Miss Jenkins." "Who's that man? Why is everyone staring?" "That's President Obama, Jamie, former President Obama. The one from the telly, the American one." "Yes, but we mustn't disturb him. He's here to pay his respects." A girl named Sophie, wearing thick glasses and a curious expression, leaned in, clutching a notebook. Sophie raised her hand eagerly. "Miss Jenkins, didn't he give that famous speech? The one my dad always talks about." "Which speech, Sophie?" "The one where he said people from different countries could be friends. Dad says it made him cry." Jenkins glanced toward Obama, then back at her students. "Perhaps we'll discuss that later. Right now, we observe quietly." Obama's attention, however, had drifted somewhere else entirely. Across the courtyard, posted outside the south wing, stood Lance Corporal Dylan Price of the Welsh Guards, 26 years old, 5 tours in Afghanistan, and absolutely motionless beneath that familiar black bearskin cap. But Price wasn't just standing there out of duty. He was remembering. 3 hours earlier, he'd received a phone call from his sister Megan in Cardiff. "Dylan," she'd said, her voice thick with emotion, "I was cleaning out Dad's things and found something. A letter he never sent." "What do you mean?" "Addressed to Obama. I mean, he wrote a bloody letter to the American president, Dylan, 3 pages long. It was tucked inside that old cassette player, the one with all his speeches." Dylan had gone quiet, processing. "What did it say?" "Oh," Dylan, Megan's voice had broken. "He wrote about you. About how proud he was that his son stood guard for queens and presidents. About how he listened to Obama's Cairo speech every night when the pain got bad because it reminded him that dignity wasn't dead in the world." The letter, written in his father's careful handwriting just weeks before he died, had been tucked inside that old cassette player like a message in a bottle. Tom Price's final words, never spoken aloud. "Mr. President, my son stands guard at your palaces now. I hope someone tells you that every word you spoke about dignity, and hope my boy carries those words with him every day. You said every person has something sacred inside them. Well, sir, you helped me remember what that felt like even when the cancer was taking everything else away. Thank you for giving an old soldier something to believe in again. Perhaps one day you'll meet my Dylan. Perhaps you'll see what your words helped create." Now, as if summoned by his father's unfinished business, the man himself was walking, straight toward Dylan. From 50 yards away, Price looked like every other Royal Guard. Perfect posture, pristine uniform, that legendary stillness. But up close, there were details that told a different story. The way his left hand gripped his rifle with just enough pressure to keep it steady but not tense. The barely perceptible tension in his jaw, the kind that comes from holding position for hours, and tucked beneath the red wool of his tunic, so small you'd miss it unless you knew what to look for. A thin ribbon of purple and gold peeked from beneath Dylan's uniform, the Elizabeth Cross. But Dylan hadn't received it for combat loss. He wore it for his father, a man who died at home, but had earned it through decades of carrying other people's grief. Obama's pace slowed without him realizing it. Something about the guard's bearing had caught his attention, not just the ceremony of it, but the presence underneath, the kind of stillness that comes from discipline, yes, but also from something deeper. Agent Mitchell noticed the change immediately. Raven is deviating from planned route, she murmured into her mic, approaching ceremonial guard position. Her partner, Agent Johnson, shifted his stance. Any cause for concern? Negative. Looks like he wants to pay respects. You know how he gets around military personnel. Roger that. Standard protocols, for now. Let him lead. At the rope barrier, an elderly gentleman in a thick wool coat was explaining something to his granddaughter. That's a Queen's Guard, love. They stand perfectly still no matter what happens. What if someone tries to talk to them? Grandpa, they're not allowed to respond. It's their duty to remain silent, even if it's someone important. Even then, Sarah, even then. Obama stopped 3 feet from the guard, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to show respect for the role and the space. Dylan didn't react, couldn't react. Protocol was absolute. Eyes forward, spine straight, breathing controlled. The former president of the United States could have been a lamppost for all the acknowledgement he was officially allowed to give. But inside that perfect stillness, Dylan Price's heart was hammering like a parade drum. He recognized the voice immediately when Obama spoke. Beautiful morning for standing watch. The words were casual, conversational, but there was something underneath, a warmth that made it clear this wasn't just idle chatter. Price said nothing, couldn't. The Welch guards don't break silence for anyone. But Obama was a man who had learned to read silence through 8 years of state dinners and diplomatic meetings, where the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words. He could see the tension in the guard's jaw, the barely perceptible shift in his breathing. This wasn't indifference, this was control. I've met a lot of soldiers over the years, Obama continued, his breath visible in the cool air. Most of them I shook their hands, thanked them for their service, said the usual things. He paused, studying Price's profile. But I always wondered about the ones I never got to meet, the ones standing watch while I was sleeping safely behind them. The school group had gone completely quiet. Even the children sensed something important was happening. The teacher placed a gentle finger to her lips, but nobody was talking anyway. Miss Jenkins, the gap-toothed boy whispered. Why isn't the soldier talking back? Because that's his job. Jamie too stands silent and still, no matter what, even if the president talks to him. Especially then. It's called discipline. Sophie adjusted her glasses and whispered to her friend, my dad says discipline is doing the right thing even when it's hard. Obama pulled out the challenge coin, turning it slowly between his fingers. The bronze caught what little light filtered through the clouds, the presidential seal gleaming in his palm. This coin, he said quietly, I've given maybe 30 of these in 8 years, always to people who went above and beyond, saved lives, showed extraordinary courage. He paused, watching raindrops gather on the coin's surface, but standing here, looking at you, I'm thinking maybe I had it backwards. Price's breathing shifted almost imperceptibly, but Obama noticed. Maybe the real courage isn't in the dramatic moments. Maybe it's in standing here, day after day, representing something bigger than yourself, being a symbol people can believe in. Agent Mitchell, monitoring from her position, spoke softly into her mic, duration extending beyond planned time. Frame, Raven appears to be having a moment. Having a moment, copy that. Any security concerns? Negative. Just let him be human for a minute. Father was military, wasn't he? Obama asked. The question landed like a stone in still water. Price's grip on his rifle tightened just enough that Obama caught it. A tiny tell. Invisible to most, but unmistakable to someone who'd spent years learning how to read people. I can tell, Obama continued quietly. It's in the way you hold yourself. Not just the training they give you here. Something deeper. Something learned at home. The way you carry that rifle, that's not ceremony. That's muscle memory. From the crowd, the elderly gentleman was watching closely. He leaned toward his granddaughter and said, "Something's happening here, love. Something important." "What do you mean, Grandpa?" "The way that president is looking at our guard. The way he's speaking. This isn't just politeness, this is recognition." Obama extended his hand, palm up. The coin rested in the center like an offering. "I keep this for special occasions. Usually give them to people who've done something extraordinary." He paused, the rain beginning to collect on the coin. "But I think I've been measuring extraordinary wrong." The crowd had gone completely silent now. Phones were still recording, but the atmosphere had shifted from casual documentation to reverent witnessing. Even the security details seemed to lean in slightly. He couldn't move, but something flickered in his eyes, just for a moment, like clouds parting to let through a single sliver of sunlight. Obama waited. He didn't press or assume. He just stood there, hands still extended, patient as stone. "Take your time," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." And then impossibly Price moved. Not much. Just enough. His right hand, which had been at parade rest behind his back, released with military precision and extended forward to accept the coin. The motion was deliberate and controlled, but also unmistakably human, a gesture that bridged the divide between ceremony and connection. Their hands met briefly, long enough for Obama to feel the steady strength in the young soldier's grip, long enough for Price to understand that this wasn't performance. This was real. "Thank you," Obama said simply. Price closed his fingers around the coin and returned to his position, but for the first time, his eyes met Obama's. Then the first words came, quiet, controlled, but carrying the full weight of 18 months of perfect silence, finally broken. "My father died this spring, sir." Obama's expression changed. The polite diplomacy vanished, replaced by something deeper, recognition of the shape of grief and the space it demands. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his voice low, and in those words lived the gravity of a man who'd stood with countless grieving families. "What was his name?" "Tom Price, Sir Thomas Arthur Price. Welch Guards, same as me, but 20 years earlier." "A good Welch name," Obama noted. "What did he do after service?" "Drove lorries through the valleys for 20 years. Never complained either. Said honest work was honest work." Obama nodded slowly. Working man," Price confirmed. "Never asked for much, but he believed in things, you know? Believed dignity wasn't just for the wealthy. Believed words could change how people saw themselves. Sounds like my kind of person." "Tell me about him." Price hesitated, then made a choice. "He had cancer, sir. Lung cancer. Toward the end, he couldn't talk much. The meds, you know. But he could still listen." "What did he listen to?" "He had this old cassette player. Battered thing from the 80s. Probably older than me. Red plastic. One speaker that crackled when you turned it up. And one recording he asked for every day." Obama's hands, which had been loosely clasped, went completely still. "Your Cairo speech, sir. June 2009. He listened to it on repeat for hours." The former president blinked slowly, absorbing the weight of it. "The one about new beginnings, about finding common ground. That's the one, sir." Price nodded. He wore out 3 different copies of that tape. His jaw tensed just slightly. "The only visible sign of everything he was holding in," he said. "You were the only politician he ever heard talk about dignity. Like it was something everyone deserved, not just the people who could vote for you." Behind them, Agent Mitchell wiped at her eyes discreetly, hoping no one noticed. "What part did he play most?" Obama asked gently. "The part about how every person carries something sacred inside them," Price replied. "And the part where you talked about working people. How they might not get their names in history books, but they're the ones who keep the world running." Obama's eyes widened a bit. "I remember writing that. Stayed up all night getting those words right." "Well, sir, you got them right for him," Price said. He'd rewind that part and play it over and over again. Said it was the first time he heard a politician talk about dignity. Like something you earn through work, not something you're handed because of where you were born. By now, the crowd around them had grown, though neither man seemed to notice. Word was spreading through the barracks, something rare, maybe unprecedented, was unfolding. But everyone kept their distance, instinctively understanding that this moment wasn't theirs to enter. "There's something else," Price said, his voice lowering. "Something I wasn't sure I should tell you." Obama stood still, waiting. "My sister found a letter this morning. Dad wrote it to you, sir. Never sent it. Just tucked it inside that old cassette player." "A letter to me?" Obama asked, voice barely above a whisper, 3 pages long, sir, written in his careful handwriting, the kind he only used for things that mattered. Price's voice grew steadier. He wrote about how your words helped him through the worst days, how listening to that speech made him feel like he still mattered even when the cancer was taking everything else away. Obama's breathing had grown shallow, his face was still, listening intently. What else did he say? He wrote about me, sir. About how proud he was that his son stood guard for queens and presidents. About how he hoped someone would tell you that your words about dignity they lived on, in places you'd never even know about. Jesus, Obama whispered. But here's the part that'll break your heart, sir. Price continued, his voice now like stone. The last line of that letter he wrote. Perhaps one day you'll meet my Dylan. Perhaps you'll see what your words helped create. Obama's composure faltered. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. His eyes filled not in a dramatic, headline-making way, but just enough for anyone watching to see the moment when professional distance dissolved into raw, human connection. He said that, Obama asked, his voice barely audible, word for word. Sir. Price confirmed. My sister read it to me over the phone this morning. Made me promise to tell you, if I ever got the chance. Back near the school group, Miss Jenkins was whispering to her students, explaining, as best she could, what they were witnessing. This is what real leadership looks like. Children, Miss Jenkins said softly. It's not about being important, it's about understanding that every person matters. Little Jaime raised his hand. Miss Jenkins, why is the president sad? He's not sad, Jaime, she replied gently. He's moved. Someone he never met trusted him to say the right thing when it mattered most. Sophie, still clutching her notebook, whispered, did he say the right thing? Yes, Sophie, Jenkins said. He did. There's more. Price continued. His voice was steady, but thick with emotion. That morning, before he passed, the nurses had turned off the tape player because he wasn't responding anymore. But I saw him trying to move his hand toward it, so I put it back on. Obama leaned in slightly, fully focused now. Your voice was the last thing he heard, sir. The part where you say that every person, regardless of race or religion or nationality, carries something sacred inside them. He died listening to you tell him he mattered. That's when Obama broke. His shoulders shook once, and he raised a hand to cover his mouth. Agent Mitchell stepped forward reflexively, then stopped, knowing that her job in that moment was simply to let him be human. I'm sorry, Obama whispered. I never know how much of what we say actually reaches people. You spend so much time choosing words, hoping they'll matter, but you never really know. It reached him, sir, Price said firmly. It reached him every day for the last 11 years of his life. In the crowd, an elderly man had removed his cap and held it over his heart. He'd served in Korea, had lost friends, and knew exactly what it looked like when grief finally found a place to land. Grandpa, why is everyone crying? His granddaughter asked softly. Because, sweetheart, he said, voice low, sometimes you get to see how one person's words can carry another through the darkest times. And that's something worth crying about. Obama took a slow, shaky breath, trying to steady himself. Dylan, may I call you Dylan? Of course, sir. Did your father ever say which words meant the most to him? Price nodded. He used to quote one line back to me whenever I doubted what I was doing. The same principle that drives a man to work with dignity in the valleys, drives a man to stand guard with honor at a palace. Obama's eyes widened. I never said those exact words. No, sir, Price replied. But that's what he heard when you talked about dignity being universal. That's how your words lived in his mind. My God, Obama breathed. He made my speech better than I did. He made everything better, sir. That was his gift. They stood there for a moment longer, two men bound by the memory of a man who had found hope in words spoken to an audience he'd never meet. Obama nodded slowly. Then, Obama did something no former president typically does in public. He stepped forward, crossing that invisible line that separates civilians from ceremony. He extended his hand, not for a handshake, not for a photo, but for a connection between two sons who understood what it meant to lose the man who taught them how to stand. Price didn't hesitate. He shifted his rifle to his left hand and reached out with his right. Their handshake was brief but firm, the kind that seals understanding rather than makes introductions. I wish I could have met him, Obama said. You did, sir, Price replied. Every time he played that tape, he used to say it was like having a conversation with an old friend. What else did he tell you about the speech? Obama asked. I mean, about what it meant to him. Price allowed himself, the faintest smile barely visible, but real. He said you understood something most politicians miss, that dignity isn't about what you have. It's about how you carry yourself when you don't have much. Obama's voice grew thick. That sounds like wisdom earned the hard way. 20 years driving lorries through Wales, sir. You learn a few things about dignity when you're hauling freight at 4 in the morning and still showing up on time because your word matters. Tell me more about him, please, Obama said. I need to understand the man who understood my words better than I did. Price glanced around, suddenly aware of the watching crowd. Then he seemed to decide it didn't matter. He never missed a day of work in 20 years, sir. Not one. Even when his arthritis got so bad he could barely hold the steering wheel. He said a man's reliability was his most important possession. I remember Wales from my visits, Obama said quietly. People who understand that character isn't what you do when people are watching. That's exactly what he'd say, sir. Character is what you do when nobody will ever know about it. From her post, Agent Mitchell spoke quietly into her mic. Command, we're significantly over schedule but recommend allowing this to continue. This is important. Copy that, Mitchell. Take all the time he needs. Obama wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring who saw. Dylan, he said, would you do me several favors, if I can, sir? First, would you give me your sister's contact information? I'd like to write to her about your father, of course, sir. Second, I want to read that letter. Would she be willing to share it? I think she'd be honored. Sir. And third, Obama paused, looking Price directly in the eyes. The next time you stand this post, I want you to remember that you're not just representing the crown. You're carrying your father's dignity with you, and that matters more than you know. Price's voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. I will, sir, every day. Good man. Obama stepped back, honoring the boundary he had crossed. I should let you return to your duties, Obama said. Actually, sir, Price replied. There's one more thing. Obama waited. That letter my father wrote, the very last line. After the part about hoping you'd meet me, he wrote, if you do meet my Dylan, tell him his old man was right about dignity. Tell him it's not what others give you, it's what you refuse to let them take away. Obama's composure shattered completely. He pressed both hands to his face and wept, not the careful tears of a public figure, but the raw grief of a man who had just received a message from beyond the grave. Everyone watching stood in complete silence, understanding they were witnessing something sacred. When Obama could speak again, his voice was hoarse but steady. It's delivered, son. Consider it delivered. As quietly as he had broken it, Price began to restore the silence. He returned his rifle to position, straightened his spine, and prepared to resume the perfect stillness that had first caught Obama's attention. But Obama wasn't quite ready to let the moment end. Dylan, he said again, using the guard's name like a benediction. Yes, sir, your father was right about dignity, and he raised a son who proves it every day. Price nodded once, sharply. Thank you, sir. That means everything. Stand tall, son. You're carrying more than you know. Obama turned and walked toward the memorial. His steps were steadier now than they'd been an hour earlier. He moved like a man who'd just been reminded why words matter, why dignity matters, and why the conversation between leaders and citizens never really ends. Behind him, Price resumed his post. The crowd began to disperse slowly, unsure of what they just witnessed but certain it had been important. Phones were put away. Whispered conversations started up again, near the rope barriers. The elderly gentleman explained quietly to his granddaughter what she had just seen. That love is what happens when someone realizes their words outlived them in the best possible way. What do you mean, Grandpa? That president thought he was just giving a speech 11 years ago. Today, he found out he'd been keeping a dying man company every night for months. The school teacher began gathering her students, but she couldn't resist one more lesson. Remember this day, children. Remember what it looks like when words travel farther than anyone imagined they could. Jaime raised his hand. Miss Jenkins, will that guard tell other people about meeting the president? No, Jaime, guards don't talk about their duties, but he'll remember it for the rest of his life. Sophie adjusted her glasses thoughtfully. Miss Jenkins, do you think the president will remember it too? I think, Sophie, this was the kind of thing you never forget. Obama completed his visit to the memorial, laying his wreath with hands that trembled slightly. He stood in silence for several minutes, head bowed, shoulders set against the rain, but his posture had changed. He no longer carried the weight of wondering whether his words mattered. Now, he carried the responsibility of knowing they did. Agent Mitchell approached quietly. "Sir, we should probably start moving toward the vehicle." Obama nodded but didn't move immediately. "Sarah, I need you to do several things for me, of course, sir. First, contact information for the Welch Guards command structure. I'm going to write some letters when we get back. Letters, sir, to a family in Cardiff, to that young man's commanding officer, to some people who deserve to know their words found their target." He paused, watching the guard resume his perfect stillness. "And Sarah." "Yes, sir?" "Call my speech writing team. I want the transcript of the Cairo speech, every draft, every revision, every word we cut. I need to remember what it felt like to write something that mattered that much." "Of course, sir. Anything else?" Obama looked back once more toward the south wing. "Yeah, clear my schedule tomorrow morning. I'm going to write some letters that should have been written years ago." As his convoy prepared to leave, Obama sat in the back seat and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for his former chief. "Speechwriter, John, it's Barak. I know it's been a while, but I need to ask you something. That Cairo speech we wrote, do you remember why we included that passage about working people? The one about dignity being universal?" He listened for a moment, then smiled for the first time all day. "I just met someone who reminded me why we do this job, why words matter, why every speech might be someone's last comfort." He paused, watching London pass by through rain-streaked windows. "I'll call you later. Right now, I have some letters to write." 3 days later, Megan Price would receive a phone call from the American Embassy. A package was being delivered to her home in Cardiff. A letter from the former president, along with a special request. "Miss Price, this is unusual, but Mr. Obama would like to include your father's letter in his presidential library with your permission, of course. He says it represents something important about how democracy really works, not just in voting booths but in the quiet moments when people find hope in each other's words." But Obama had done something else too. He'd asked his foundation to establish a small scholarship fund for children of service members in Wales. Nothing grand, nothing with his name on it. Just a bit of help for kids whose parents stood watch while the rest of the world slept safely. It would be called the Thomas Arthur Price Memorial Scholarship for the children of working people who understood that dignity wasn't inherited, it was earned. But that day, in the rain outside Wellington Barracks, none of that had happened. Yet, that day was about two men finding each other across an impossible distance, connected by the memory of a third, a man who had believed that words could change the world. And maybe, just maybe they could. 6 months later, Dylan Price was promoted to corporal. During the ceremony, his commanding officer mentioned a letter received from Washington, a commendation for representing the finest traditions of the Welch Guards, with exceptional dignity under extraordinary circumstances. But Price never told anyone what conversation led to that commendation. Guards don't discuss their duties. He did, however, keep that bronze challenge coin in his breast pocket every day he stood watch. And sometimes, when the rain fell just right, and the wind carried the sound of distant traffic, he'd remember his father's voice, mixing with an American president's words, reminding him that dignity is something you choose to carry, no matter who's watching. Some conversations change everything even when they happen in whispers. Some silences are worth breaking, even when it costs you everything. And sometimes the dying man's final wish gets answered by a miracle disguised as coincidence. Would you have broken protocol for a moment like that? Do you think some silences are meant to be broken? And what would you have said if you were standing where that guard stood? If this story reminded you why respect matters, hit that like button. If you want more stories that reveal the humanity behind the uniform, subscribe and ring the notification bell. And if someone you know needs to be reminded of what dignity in action looks like, share this video with them. Your next story is waiting on your screen right now. Click it, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the most powerful exchanges happen when we remember we're all human. Same time, same place. Don't miss it.